and to even, to a certain extent, the Exxon Valdez oil spill. BP oil spills in 2010, Exxon Valdez is back in the mid-'80s. And yet those two are talked fundamentally more, orders of magnitude more than the Kalamazoo oil spill. But I think there are a lot of lessons to draw from the Kalamazoo oil spill and the causes of it and the human error involved. And also to say when we experience things like the Kalamazoo oil spill, we should just more critically assess what exactly we're doing, why we're doing it that particular way, and if that particular way is in fact what we all agree is the best way to go about it. So the Kalamazoo oil spill is a pipeline oil spill that occurs in the Kalamazoo River in sort of the Midwestern part of Michigan, right? The river ultimately, releases itself into Lake Michigan. And so this is a very important, waterway in terms of its environmental effect. And so there is a gigantic oil spill directly into the waterway. Why? Well, because the pipeline itself crosses the river, right? So if you look at this particular graph here, here's the pipeline, and you'll notice that it crosses the river. And in fact, it doesn't actually cross the river per se, it crosses a tributary of the river. Right, so this is a creek which flows into the river, and of course the river ends up kind of flowing in this direction. And so this is where the actual pipeline leaks, and 840,000 gallons of oil spill into this creek and then flow into the Kalamazoo River. And one thing you have to understand about this is that, the recognition that there actually was an oil spill took more than one day, right? There's always this belief like, okay, if there's like a wide-scale environmental problem, it's going to be very visible. But the spill started at night, and this is a fairly remote part of the state. And so oil is just spilling into this creek for hours and hours and hours and hours, and nobody really knows about it. And in fact, it's a little bit worse than that. So here is the aerial footage. This is several days after the oil spill. Obviously, at a certain point, it becomes, obvious. It becomes this is a problem. There's clearly a gigantic oil spill in Kalamazoo. Enbridge is actually a Canadian oil company, so they're not even a U.S. company. This is oil which is coming down from primarily the Alberta region of Canada. If you know anything about the Alberta region of Canada, this is oil which is extremely dirty oil. The Canadian tar sands or the Albertan tar sands is the primary, source of the oil that comes through. Now, Enbridge as a company has stated that this oil wasn't completely tar sands oil, that this was a mixture, so it wasn't as quote unquote dirty oil. When I say dirty oil, so tar sands oil is thicker, it's grittier, and usually the way in which you extract tar sands oil is through an incredibly resource-intensive process with a tremendous amount of fresh water, and they literally steam the oil from the bedrock. And as a result, that blunt process, this isn't like Saudi Arabian oil, which is like pristine oil. This is extremely dirty oil. And not only is it much costlier to refine, almost triple the cost of refinement to most of the other oil that is seen around the world, but also the burning of it is dirtier, has more emissions, more methane, more CO2. In addition to that, it is worse for the environment. So if it does experience a spill, it dollar for dollar creates more damage than, let's say, your average viscosity oil. So prior to the oil spill, there were 15,000 documented defects in this pipeline alone. Okay, 15,000 defects. Now, the company decides that those defects are not that problematic, and they basically do nothing. They have sensors all down the pipeline. The idea is the sensor tells them when a spill has occurred, or a problem has occurred. So that way they know, they're monitoring it. And there's someone in an office somewhere monitoring the sensors. Well, on that particular day when the oil spill started, the spill was viewed as a bubble. And what happens is that sometimes bubbles form in the pipeline and it stops the oil flow. In order to get the oil flow going, they will pump a lot more oil into the pipeline and it moves things along. But it wasn't a bubble. There was a hole in the pipeline and there was oil spilling into the creek. And when they sent additional oil, when they increased the pressure to pop the bubble, of course, all that was going on was that more oil was spilling into the creek. For 18 hours, this is what occurred. For 18 hours, there was a higher flow of oil than normally into this creek and eventually into the Kalamzaoo River, right? So just complete system humans error at the heart of this particular problem. Early response reports were $800 million in damages. Most recent reports I've seen have put that well over $1 billion. $1.2 billion was the last estimate I saw. In response to this, of course, all these assessments and studies were done to understand why things occurred. A report by NPR put out in 2012 said that the Pipeline and Hazardous Safety Materials Administration in the United States is severely understaffed and its regulations are very weak. All right, and that's not by accident. Right? There is a clear strategy by oil companies to weaken the regulatory oversight of pipelines, because not only does that improve their bottom line, but it also in a way gives them additional political power. And oil companies invest a ton of money every year in political power because it's lucrative. Right? If businesses are profit maximizers, we can look at all of their behaviors as profit maximizing behaviors. And so when BP or Exxon lobbies the U.S. government, Enbridge lobbies the U.S. government, that's seen as a profit maximizing decision. And so through lobbying efforts and also just through a general malaise of U.S. politicians to critically, deal with the pipeline problem in the U.S., very little is done, very little is kind of there. This, of course, heightens the concern over other pipelines in the U.S., for example, like the Keystone Pipeline of much fame. And of course, beyond, the additional political, not really political issues, but beyond the issues of like the Keystone Pipeline going across sovereign Native American land is a big issue. Interestingly enough, just to kind of link that particular issue, and I think it's often important for us to look at consistent behavior. So as you probably know, one of the key arguments against the Keystone Pipeline out in the Dakota and into the Wyoming regions is that it in Colorado, I believe as well, it crosses Native American land that was promised to Native Americans by the U.S. government to be maintained. Of course, putting a pipeline on it is not maintaining it per se. The Enbridge pipeline that we were just discussing, again, it's a Canadian pipeline. It also crosses indigenous populations' land as well. Mackinac Island in Michigan is home to a Native American tribe, and that pipeline goes directly through their land. And so there's this interesting consistency between poor environmental policy being aligned with what I think a lot of people would agree is, poor treatment of indigenous populations in the United States, which is a pretty consistent thing, not just in the United States, but in many other countries. Indigenous populations in the